Very good morning to all of you, brethren. Good. I'm glad to see you all awake and alive. And thanks for those prayers from all of you for my mother. I must say that she's vastly improved. She's back to her old self again, so, thank God for that. His mercies endure forever, as we've heard this morning. We all wonder what will happen to us after we die. And when a loved one dies, we ask the question, will we have a glorious reunion with them? Or is death the end of all consciousness? So point number A asks the question, what does the Bible teach about life after death? What does the Bible teach about life after death? See, point number 1 says, in the Bible, Jesus taught that life does not end after death. No, life does not end after death. He made the startling claim in John 11 verse 25. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. So he doesn't say he gives or he raises people up or gives people life. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. And he was the one who blew the breath of life into Adam's nostrils on the day that he created him from the ground. He says, those who believe in me, and hopefully we all believe in Jesus Christ, even though they die like everyone else, will live again. So the Bible says all of us sitting here, when we die, we are going to live again. And we see that faith and grace goes hand in hand. Remember, Ephesians 2 verse 8 to 9 says, by grace you have been saved through faith, and not of yourself, it is a gift of God. The Bible then says, according to the eyewitnesses closest to him, Jesus demonstrated his power over death by rising from the dead, after being crucified and buried for 3 days. It is this belief, brethren, that has given hope to all of us as Christians for nearly 2,000 years. But some people have no hope after life, hope of life after death. The atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote, I believe that when I die, I shall rot in my grave, and nothing of my own ego will survive. He says, when I die, that's it. I go back to dust, and that's goodbye, Charlie. Russell obviously didn't believe Jesus' words. But point number 2 says, the Bible says that Jesus was seen alive after his death. Jesus' followers wrote that he appeared alive to them after his crucifixion and burial. They claim not only to have seen him, but also to have eaten with him and touched him and actually spent 40 days with him. So now the skeptics ask, point number 3, but wasn't Jesus' resurrection just a story? Right? That's the question we can ask. Wasn't Jesus' resurrection a story? Was this not only simply a legend that grew over time, or is it based upon solid evidence? The answer to this question is foundational to Christianity. For if Jesus did rise from the dead, it would prove all he said about himself, all about the meaning of life, and about our destiny after death to be true, right? Or if the resurrection account of Jesus is not true, then Christianity would be founded upon a lie. Right? We will all be fooled. So point number 4 says the claim of resurrection is vital to Christianity. We can see that the claim of the resurrection is vital to Christianity. It's the crux of the whole matter. If Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead, let's go home and have a party. Let's eat, drink and be merry, because tomorrow we die and we rot. And that's it. Okay? The theologian R.C. Sproul puts it this way. If Christ had been raised from the dead by God, then he has the credentials and the certification that no other religious leader possesses. Buddha is dead, right? Muhammad is dead. Moses is dead. Confucius is dead. And so every other great leader in the Bible is dead. Joshua, David, Samuel, Saul, Paul, you know, name them. They are all dead. But according to Christianity, Jesus Christ is alive. Can you see the big claim that Christianity makes? Point number 5 says, many skeptics have attempted to disprove the resurrection. Many skeptics have attempted to disprove the resurrection. Josh McDowell spent more than 700 hours researching the evidence for the resurrection. This skeptic stated regarding the importance of the resurrection. He says, I have come to the conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is one of the most wicked, vicious, heartless hoaxes ever foisted upon the minds of men. Or it is the most fantastic fact of history. So it's either a myth or it's a fact. Point number 6 says, so is Jesus' resurrection a fantastic fact or a vicious myth? Is it a fantastic fact or a vicious myth? So to find out, we need to look at the evidence of history and draw our own conclusions. And we'll look at those Christians and anti-Christians, right? Point number B says, what did skeptics who examined the resurrection discover? What did the skeptics who examined the resurrection discover? But before we go there, point number 1, let's just ask the question, what is the difference between a cynic and skeptics? What is the difference between cynics and skeptics? You see, sadly, not everyone is willing to fairly examine the evidence. These people are called cynics. Bertrand Russell admits his take on Jesus was not concerned with historical fact. So he wasn't concerned about that. He wasn't prepared to examine the historical facts. So was the historian Joseph Campbell. Without citing evidence, calmly told his PBS television audience that the resurrection of Jesus is not a factual event. But he never gave proof of why he said that. Other scholars such as Don Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar agreed with him. Now, none of these cynics presented any evidence of their own. They just said, no, that's all nonsense. True skeptics, as opposed to cynics, are interested in the evidence. They go and look at the evidence. In a Skeptic magazine editorial entitled, What is a Skeptic?, the following definition is given. Skepticism is the application of reason to any and all ideas. No sacred cows allowed. So they go out there and they look at everything. They examine everything and they turn it upside down and inside out. In other words, skeptics do not go into an investigation close to the possibility that the phenomenon might be real or that a claim might be true. When we say we are skeptical, we mean that we must see compelling evidence before we believe. So let's hear and see how they analyze the evidence for what is perhaps the most important question in the history of the human race. That's point number C. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? And we're going to look at some of that proof this morning. And the first one is that Jesus himself prophesied it. Jesus himself prophesied it. In advance of his death, Jesus told his disciples that he would be betrayed, that he would be arrested and crucified, and that he would come back to life 3 days later. Would you say that's a strange plan? Right? That's a very strange plan. Point number 2, ask the question then, what was behind this plan? What was behind this plan? You see, Jesus wanted to show that his death and resurrection would prove to people that he was indeed the Messiah. Because that's what the Bible prophesied. And Jesus wanted to prove that he was that Messiah. The Bible scholar Wilbur Smith remarked about Jesus when he said that he himself would rise again from the dead the 3rd day after he was crucified. He said something that only a fool would dare say, right? If I'm going to say to you guys, I'm going to be killed today, and Tuesday morning, I'll be up walking around. What are you going to say? Hello? Hello? Right. Right. You see? He would rise again from dead. The third day after he was crucified, he said something that only a fool would dare say. If he expected longer the devotion of any disciples, unless he was sure he was going to arise. No founder of any world religion known to men ever dared say a thing like that. Nobody's ever said that in history. Only Jesus Christ. In other words, since Jesus had clearly told his disciples that he would rise again after his death, failure to keep that promise would expose him as a fraud. Right? So let's look at point number D. Says, how did Jesus die before he rose again? Because we've got to make sure that this guy was dead before he rose again. Right? Otherwise it's just a hoax. Point number 1 says, a horrific death and then. A horrific death and then what? To get an account of Christ's death, let's go back to the back pages of any gospel in your New Testament to find out what happened. As Jesus predicted, he was betrayed. Right? By one of his own disciples, Judas Iscariot. And he was arrested. In a mock trial under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, he was convicted of treason and condemned to die on a wooden cross. Prior to being nailed to the cross, Jesus was first what? Brutally beaten with a Roman cat o' nine tails, a whip with bits of bone and metal that would rip his flesh. He was punched repeatedly, kicked and spat upon. Then using mallets, the Roman executioners pounded the heavy wrought iron nails into Jesus' wrists and feet. And finally they dropped the cross in a hole in the ground between two other crosses bearing convicted thieves. And there Jesus Christ hung for 6 hours. Then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cried out, "It is finished. It is finished," and died. Suddenly the sky went dark and an earthquake shook the land. But Pilate wanted verification that Jesus was dead before allowing his crucified body to be buried. So a Roman guard thrust a spear into Jesus' side. Thrust a spear into his side. Right? And it wasn't a little thing like this. You know, those Romans had a big spear. They thrust it into his side. The mixture of blood and water that flowed out was a clear indication that Jesus Christ was dead. Jesus' body was then taken down from the cross and buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. The Roman guards then next sealed the tomb, right? And secured it with a 24-hour watch. Meanwhile, Jesus' disciples were in shock. I mean, they just ran away. Here this guy said he's going to be the Messiah. He's dead. And he's buried. All hope was vanquished. Rome and the Jewish leaders were victorious. Or so it seemed. Point number E says, but something happened. Something happened. But it wasn't the end. The Jesus movement did not disappear. And in fact, Christianity exists today as the world's largest religion. Therefore, we've got to know what happened after Jesus' body was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb. In a New York Times article, Peter Steinfeld cites the startling events that occurred 3 days after Jesus' death. Now remember, before that, the disciples disappeared. They ran away. They were frightened. Peter even denied Jesus Christ 3 times when they asked him. So you must know how frightened these guys were for their lives. Okay? They were living in fear, hiding away. He says, shortly after Jesus was executed, his followers were suddenly galvanized from a baffled and cowering group into people whose message about a living Jesus and a coming kingdom preached at the risk of their lives, eventually changed an empire. Something happened, but exactly what? There are only 5 plausible explanations for Jesus' alleged resurrection, as portrayed in the New Testament. And the first one is, Jesus didn't really die on the cross. That's one explanation. Jesus never really died on the cross. It was a whole hoax. They wangled the thing and he disappeared. And what's it? Secondly, the resurrection was a conspiracy. Lots of people got together and they made a big conspiracy and they said, no, we'll say Jesus Christ was resurrected. Thirdly, the disciples were hallucinating. They were all on drugs. They smoked a weed or something like that grew around Jerusalem at that time. Right? In other words, it's worse. Fourth, the account is legendary. In other words, the account is a story. It's just a story that they were telling. And the fifth point is, it really happened. It really happened. So we're going to work our way through these options and see which one best fits the facts. Right? We're all skeptics here this morning, so we want the facts. So the first one is, was Jesus dead? Was he really dead? Was this guy really dead? Before we piece together evidence for a resurrection, we must first establish that there was in fact a corpse. There was a dead corpse. Right? After all, occasionally the newspapers will report on some corpse in a morgue who was found stirring and recovered. Walking in, this guy sitting up on the table. Hello, what am I doing here? No, but you died. No, I didn't die. Right? And it's happened. So, couldn't that have happened with Jesus Christ? Right? Some have proposed that Jesus lived through the crucifixion and was revived by the cool, damp air in the tomb. Now, after all those things that was done to him, beaten and crucified and hanging on a cross for 6 hours, and then stabbed with a spear, blood and water running out of him. Some still say the cool, damp air in the tomb could have revived him. But that theory doesn't square with the medical evidence. You see, now these guys are going to look at the medical evidence. An article in the Journal of American Medical Association explained why the so-called swoon theory is unattainable. They say people go into a swoon and then they die, inverted commas, and then they wake up. Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicated that Jesus was dead. The spear thrust between his right ribs probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium. I think that's the heart sac that's around what's name, and the heart, and thereby ensured his death. And if there's a hole in your heart, a big spear go through your heart, that's tickets. That's goodbye, Charlie. But the skepticism of this verdict may be in order, as this case has been cold for 2,000 years. At the very least, we need a second opinion. So let's not only look at what the Bible says, let's look at what people who were not Christians, but who were Romans, say. One place to find that is the reports of non-Christian historians from around the time when Jesus lived. 3 of these historians mentions the death of Jesus. Lucian referred to Jesus as a crucified philosopher, right? He spoke about Jesus Christ, who was a philosopher, and he was crucified. Josephus, he's a Jewish writer, wrote, "At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of amazing deeds. When Pilate condemned him to the cross, the leading men amongst us, having accused him, those who loved him did not cease to do so." Right? So there was another one. Tacitus wrote, "Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty at the hands of our procurator, Pontius Pilate." There, these 3 guys confirmed that Jesus Christ was dead. You see, this is like going into the archives and finding that on one spring day in the 1st century, the Jerusalem Post ran a front page story saying that Jesus was crucified and dead. Right? In fact, there is no historical account from Christians, Romans, or Jews that disputes either Jesus' death or his burial. Even skeptical scholars who denied the resurrection agree that Jesus was dead. Right? When they looked at all the evidence, they came to the conclusion that Jesus was dead, that he died. Noted skeptic James Tabor stated, "I think we need to have no doubt that given Jesus' execution by Roman crucifixion, he was truly dead." And the Romans were one of the most cruel soldiers that you could meet. When they killed you properly. Right? He was as dead as a stone. John Crossan of the notoriously skeptical Jesus Seminar agreed that Jesus really lived and died. He states that he was crucified as sure as anything historically can ever be. In the light of such evidence, we seem to be on good grounds for dismissing the first of our 5 options. Jesus was clearly dead. Of that there was no doubt. Alright, so everybody agreed that Christ died. Point number 2 talks about the matter of the empty tomb. The matter of the empty tomb. No serious historian really doubts Jesus was dead when he was taken down from the cross. However, many have questioned how Jesus' body disappeared from the tomb. English journalist Dr. Frank Morrison initially thought the resurrection was either a myth or a hoax. And he began research to write a book refuting it. The book became famous, but for reasons other than the original intent. Morrison began by attempting to solve the case of the empty tomb. You see, the skeptic, he wants to go and solve this thing. The tomb belonged to a member of the Sanhedrin Council, Joseph of Arimathea. Everyone knew who was on the council, right? Everyone knew who was on the council. So Joseph must have been a real person. There's never been any doubt that he wasn't a real person. Otherwise, the Jewish leaders would have exposed the story as a fraud in their attempt to disprove the resurrection. Also, Joseph's tomb would have been at a well-known location and easily identifiable. He was a rich man, so everybody knew that was his tomb, right? So, any thoughts of Jesus being lost in the graveyard? You know, a lot of people said, no man, there was thousands of people dead. He was just lost in the graveyard. No, he went into a very special tomb. A rich man's tomb. So that we can dismiss. Morrison wondered why Jesus' enemies would have allowed the empty tomb myth to persist if it wasn't true. I mean, if it wasn't true, they would have, the first one would have said, no, there's somebody in that tomb there. Right? But it was empty. The discovery of Jesus' body would have instantly killed the entire plot. I mean, all they had to do is go and look where the disciples could have hidden the body, grabbed it, and there's the body. Right? But there's no body. And what is known historically of Jesus' enemies is that they accused Jesus' disciples of stealing the body. They said no, they stole the body. And the accusation clearly predicted on a shared belief that the tomb was empty. I mean, if somebody steals a body, that means that tomb is empty, right? So, that's the conclusion. The tomb was empty. Dr. Paul A. Meyer, professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University, similarly stated, if all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it is indeed justifiable to conclude that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was actually empty on the morning of the first Easter. And no shred of evidence has yet been discovered that would disprove this statement. So the tomb was empty. The Jewish leaders were stunned. They accused the disciples of stealing Jesus' body. But the Romans had assigned a 24-hour watch. Now, how would poor the disciples that's got no weapons go and steal steal the body with this Roman watch, which consisted of 12 guards at the time. But the Romans had assigned a 24-hour watch at the tomb with a trained guard unit from 4 to 12 soldiers. 24 hours. And those guys, if something happened, they died. They died. Morrison asked, how could these professionals have let Jesus' body be vandalized? How could they allow these people to steal? Right? It would have been impossible for anyone to have slipped by the Roman guards and to have moved the 2-ton stone. So if you gone past the guards, here's this big 2-ton stone that about 10 or 20 people would be needed to roll it away. Right? Yet the stone was moved away and the body of Jesus was missing. If Jesus' body was anywhere to be found, his enemies would have quickly exposed the resurrection as a fraud. Right?